Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A quick update for you on today's episode. Shortly after we recorded this interview, BC United leader Kevin Falcon revealed that in order to maintain their official registration as a party, a, quote, select handful of BC United candidates would, in fact, run in the coming election. But the BC United campaign as a whole remains suspended, and Falcon says the party's endorsement of the Conservatives in the upcoming election still stands, despite the candidates it may be running, which honestly makes the whole situation you're going to learn about today even stranger. But if it helps to understand it, it has been pointed out that registered parties need to receive 5% of the total provincial vote in order to continue receiving an annual allowance from the Chief Electoral Officer between elections. Here's an in-depth explanation of the whole mess. Political parties, they come and go, you know? 1 minute, you've been governing a province for 16 straight years. The next day, you're the official opposition. A couple years after that, you change your name. A few months after the name change, you fall to third in the polls, and then you keep falling, and all of a sudden, you're not a party anymore. It happens that fast.
Kevin Falcon and BC United won't be on the ballot in the upcoming election. The party leader announcing he was withdrawing all candidates and suspending their campaign.
The end of the BC Liberal Party, which had been rebranded as BC United in a move that's now fair to say did not work at all, is the sign of a shift in British Columbia. One that echoes a shift we've seen in polls across Canada over the last couple of years. But how massive a shift remains to be seen. This fall's election between the NDP and the Conservatives, who have now been endorsed by former BC United leader Kevin Falcon, is still extremely close. So how much of an impact has the implosion of a major party had on that race? Exactly how does a major party that competed for decades implode so quickly? And what can the polls tell us about what's happening in BC and in the other provinces that will vote this fall? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Philippe J. Fournier is the editor-in-chief of 338 Canada, a site that examines polling from across Canada, also a little bit in the U.S. He wrote about BC's conservative shift in the Walrus. The polls have changed remarkably, I guess, in British Columbia in just a short amount of time, Philippe.
That is correct, Jordan. When we look at the numbers over the past year and a quarter, maybe 5 quarters, we have seen a dramatic shift, something that points to a generational realignment in British Columbia. So ResearchCo is a local pollsters. They're based in Vancouver. In May 2023, it had the NDP, the incumbent NDP, at 46% province-wide. And the BC Liberals, who had just changed their names to the BC Uniteds, were at 33%. The BC Conservatives were at 4%. So still a marginal party.
How long ago was this? You said May of last year.
May 23, absolutely. So fast forward 12 months, May 2024, we see 42% for the NDP, so a modest swing downwards, but nothing to write home about. The Conservatives went from 4% to 32%. And meanwhile, the BC Uniteds, they went from 33 to 12. And this is May of 2024. And over the course of the summer, the numbers have improved for the Conservatives still. And the BC Uniteds have went into single digits, and now it looks like they are no more.
We'll talk about all of that in detail as we kind of go, because it is kind of an unprecedented situation. But first, during that year from May to May that you just described, you're somebody that watches all polls very closely. Was there a particular time or a moment when you realized like something was really fundamentally shifting here?
I was in Quebec City for the Federal Conservative Convention. That was in early September 23, so last year. And it was during that convention that I met conservatives from across the country. And of course, they saw my name tag with 338 and they all wanted to talk to me. And that was all fine and good. And I was told, watch out for BC, because the BC conservatives, who had been somewhat marginal up to that point, were trying to ride the coattails of Pierre Poilievre. And also, BC was unique, except for Quebec, in English Canada at least, that the Liberal Party, usually it's associated with being a centrist or center-left politics. But in BC, it was the main right-of-center party, even though this would be disputed by many people, but it would be the center-right party. So like similar to Quebec, right?
Right.
But there were increasingly number of voters, especially in the interior of BC, who called themselves conservatives, who voted conservative federally, that felt that the liberal branding was not reflecting of their positions. And so they were attracted to this conservative party provincially, who up to that point had been marginal. And there was a poll from Main Street Research during that federal conservative convention that showed suddenly the BC United and the BC Conservatives were tied. So the first big shift happened, and 4 new polls in that fall showed similar results. So the BC, formerly known as the Liberals, were falling down, and those points were going to the Conservatives. And so there's much of branding in there. It was not all branding, of course, but it really helped. And meanwhile, for a time in the projections, with a right-of-center vote being completely divided, we could foresee the NDP winning in a landslide. And I mean a landslide. The projections had the NDP winning over 80 seats out of 93 in the provincial BC legislature. But for that to happen, you had to have a divided right. And the right is divided no more in BC.
Rewind a little bit more for me, because you started by mentioning May 2023, and you said when BC United had just took on that name. Why did they make that change? Is that, you mentioned the Conservatives are riding Poilievre's coattails. Is this the reverse, running away from the association with Trudeau?
Well, there are several reasons, and in the inside, they will tell you a long list of reasons, but that definitely was part of it. They did not want to be associated with the federal Liberals because they consider themselves a right-of-center party, and the federal Liberals have not been that since Trudeau took over, especially in the recent years. And so I think they felt that they needed new branding, a new name to throw the party forward in the future. But it backfired spectacularly. And I think after this election, when we have the benefit of hindsight, we will be able to say it must have been the absolutely worst political rebranding in Canadian history. You would have to go back to the 30s and 20s to find similar bad moves. Obviously, again, branding was not the only problem. Leader Kevin Falcon was never that much popular. He's not a great public speaker. The numbers that we saw in the polls showed that he was not catching on. So that was not the only problem. But you changed the brand, a brand that had history, with some warts, of course, but that had history, a Liberal Party that had dominated electorally the 21st century in British Columbia. And now it's just gone. The red is gone. They replaced it with pink and teal, and it never caught on. And now, again, pink and teal, well, that lasted 1 year, and now it's disappeared into the ether.
Let's talk about what happened the past couple of weeks and the big blow up. Right before that, before BC United apparently just blew up, where were they in the polls, and what were they saying sort of right at that date when they must have made the call, like, let's just abandon ship?
It's absolutely insane to look at those shifts. If you go on my website, 338canada.com/BC, you can see the graph over time since 2022. And you can see those lines, that dark blue line and that red line, cross over at the fall of 23, and the Liberals never being able to recover. So just a few weeks ago, before the collapse or the folding of BC Liberal, or United, if you will, they were projected to lose all of their seats, basically. They won 28 seats, the Liberals did, in the 2020 election in British Columbia. They were the official opposition. They suffered a bad loss, but they still had a third of the popular vote. So they were the official opposition. It was a normal loss for the BC Liberals. The last polls that we had in BC had the Uniteds at 9, 10, 11%, basically indicating that they had lost 2/3 of their support. And losing 2/3 of their support, yes, you could have local effects, like pockets of support that still support strong local candidates. But the projections that we had showed that United were looking at the abyss of 0 seats. From 28 seats in the election, 32% of the vote, to single digits and absolutely 0 seats. And so perhaps they figured, you know what, we won't be able to turn that ship around. We won't be able to steer course. And leader Kevin Falcon just abandoned his party. Unbeknownst to his MLAs and the candidates that were nominated for United, he struck a deal with the Conservatives to not sign any nomination paper. So that's why the Uniteds will disappear.
We've said vanished, we've said blown up. You said he did it to the party. What actually happened, like technically, I guess?
I want to preface this answer that I am not an expert in party constitutions, but here's what I will tell you. If you start a new party, be very careful what you put in your party constitution, because apparently Mr. Falcon did not break any rules. He's the leader, and he's the only one who is allowed to sign nomination paper. If he says to a candidate, no, you will not run as a BC United in this riding, I will not sign those papers, that's it. There's no caucus meeting, there's no member voting, there's no convention.
Wow.
The leader chooses. And so this is the case of the leader blowing up his own party, basically. Which is fascinating, because at first I was like, well, he can't do that.
Right.
Or at least his MLAs, his caucus can say, no, we're not fired, you're fired. We'll change leaders instead. But there was no mechanism in the party constitution to do that. Again, I will let the experts on this dive deeper, but basically this is the gist of it, that the leader just sabotages his own party.
Look, 9 or 10%, like you said, it's not much, but it's not nothing in what now sure looks like a very close race, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So there were two ways to think about this. First, you would think that BC United voters would be more inclined to go to the Conservatives because they are a right-of-center party. Mm-hmm. They are trying to replace the Liberals, basically. But also, that move of voters from one party to the other occurred over the course of a year. And it's not like it hasn't been public. We had pollsters from across the country, Leger, the English Read Institute, Palace Data, Main Street Research, all these major high-rated pollsters polled BC and saw the same trends.
So if they were going to go, they would have gone sometime over the past year.
Yeah, and there's a reason they were holding out. It's because they did not feel inclined to vote for the John Rustad Conservatives. So before we saw any polling, my thought was that, okay, maybe it's going to be split down the middle. You could imagine that some of these voters will prefer to stay home instead of going to the Conservatives or voting for David Eby's NDP. But right after it happened, two pollsters went on the field, Palace Data and the English Read Institute. And remarkably, those two pollsters use different methods. One is IVR, so that's automated calls. The other use an online panel. They had identical numbers. Palace Data had 44% for the NDP, 43% for the Conservatives, so basically a tie. And the English Read Institute, the same afternoon that first poll was released, had 44% for the Conservatives, 43% for the NDP. So basically identical polls. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with an election that, I mean, it's not started yet, but we are entering soon into it. An election that really could be decided by a handful of ridings. A handful of ridings where the ground game, the local candidates could make a tremendous difference. And it's also a huge flashback to the 2017 election. Remember, Christy Clark lost that election. Well, she won the most seats, but she was 1 seat short of a majority.
Right.
And that seat short made a whole difference because the NDP and the Greens teamed up and Jordan Horgan of the NDP became leader. So, right. And again, if I can make a little parenthesis here, think of the BC Liberals in power since the early 2000s. Lose in 2017 by 1 seat, and 7 years later, they don't exist anymore. Like, it tells you how fast sometimes it can go in politics. And we know that BC politics can be quirky sometimes, but that's one other example of a party just vanishing after dominating the last few decades.
Well, speaking of the difference then that one seat can make, you mentioned, there are still former BC Liberals, I guess former BC United candidates out there who never became candidates, some of whom presumably formerly held seats or are well-liked within their ridings. Could one of those people make a difference either by swinging support in a key riding, or do we know if any of them will run as an independent because they have enough name recognition just in that riding?
So the caucus of the Conservatives had 5 MLAs, all of them floor crossers from the Liberals. They added 3 more.
Okay.
And we know at least a handful of candidates that were supposed to run for the BC United that now will wear the colors of the Conservatives. So yes, the answer is, I don't want to say it's a merger because it's not, but some of them are switching over and switching colors. But we know at least 2 cases of candidates of the Uniteds that decide, you know what, I'm going to go as an independent. I am known locally. I do not accept this swallowing up of my party by the Conservatives, and so I will run against the Conservatives in the riding. But this is, again, very fluid. It just happened. If we did this podcast next week, I would probably have a more complete answer for you, but it will shake up a lot before the writ is dropped on September 21st.
Do we know, speaking of that writ dropping and, again, looking at the election and how close it is, do we have any polls that tell us what the most important wedge issues are in BC or what will matter in this election?
Yes, we do. They are not overwhelmingly different from what we see elsewhere in the country. Mm-hmm. Housing, of course, is a big thing. For some voters, it is the environment, but it usually doesn't move a lot of votes. We have, of course, the opioid crisis. That is big in BC. And so when I said a few minutes ago that Mr. Rostad and the provincial Conservatives were riding on the coattails of Pierre Poilievre, I mean, they did not hide that fact. They basically campaign on the same issues. The carbon tax. BC is not subjected to the federal carbon tax. Why? Because they have a provincial carbon tax. And so Mr. Rostad already said that he would probably scrap that. So these issues are not that much different from what we see in the country. But I see this as a very interesting test lab for what we could see federally next year or before.
How does this dramatic change in the current makeup of BC politics reflect and resemble the federal situation? What can it tell us about not maybe the federal election, which I guess now we might get sooner than we thought, but about just what's happening in provinces across the country?
Well, I would not say that BC is it's a kind of a unique case.
And it's not normally thought of as a bellwether for Canada, right? It's normally like, oh, you got all those left-wing hippies out in BC, they're going to elect the NDP or the Liberals, blah, 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 right? That's normally how I think the rest of Canada sees that province.
Well, some stereotypes die hard, that's true. But you are correct in one point that federally, half of the NDP caucus has seats in British Columbia.
Right.
And when we look at the polling, again, the federal polling, the federal Conservatives are crushing their rivals in British Columbia.
Wow.
The projections even show that NDP seats in BC, in the lower mainland, even in Vancouver, maybe just outer Vancouver, would be in danger of falling to the Conservatives because that support is so strong and motivated. But provincially, British Columbia has had NDP governments for decades now. And so they see the difference between the federal and the provincial NDP. And so that link is not as linear as one would think. I think that Mr. Poilievre and his team for sure have helped Mr. Rostad. But would they absolutely want Mr. Rostad in power? That's another question. That's more, I don't want to play 4D chess here, but it's always good in politics to have a good opponent. Sure. And to have Mr. Eby there of the NDP, keeping the carbon tax, could be good fodder for the federal Conservatives in the election that should come up within a year. So the link is not as linear as other places, for sure.
The last thing I want to ask you is specifically about 2 other provinces that are both going to the polls this fall, and that's New Brunswick and Saskatchewan. And I guess, we've talked a lot this summer about elections all over the place, swinging wildly, often against the incumbent. And that's certainly obviously something that we're seeing happening in BC. In those two provinces, are we seeing the same things there in the early polling?
Not quite. I would say New Brunswick, which will go 2 days after BC. It's on October 21st. New Brunswick will see a race between the provincial Liberals and the incumbent PCs of Blaine Higgs. The Liberals have a good leader in Susan Holt. She's been touring the province for months now, and her message seems to be resonating. But the provincial map in New Brunswick is so disadvantageous to the Liberals because the Liberals have many, many votes in the northern part of the province, the Francophone part of the province. And so let's remember in 2018, when the provincial Liberals lost power to the PCs, they won the popular vote by 6 points, but they lost by 1 seat. And so Mr. Higgs can look at the polls in New Brunswick and look and say, even if we lose by 4 or 5 points, we could still win the election. So, but it should be a close race between the traditional parties in New Brunswick. As for Saskatchewan, well, it's the longest dynasty that we have in this country right now. The Sask Party has been in power for, 17 years?
Right.
And it's really hard to see them losing this election, even if the polls show a closer race. The Sask Party won by almost 30 points in 2020.
Oh, okay.
It was a landslide. It was a blowout. Now we have some polls in Saskatchewan that show that maybe just a handful of points separate the Sask Party, which is the Conservative Party, and the NDP there. But again, the map, it makes a whole difference because the NDP is doing well in the cities, Saskatoon and Regina, but outside the cities, the rural Saskatchewan, the numbers are overwhelming for the Sask Party. And so we could have, again, a case of the seat count not reflecting quite the percentage of voting. But we will follow that as we go along. It's going to be a very busy October for election watchers like myself.
Not even mentioning the big dog in all of this down south, which you're also watching as well. So,
are they having a vote? Yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah, they're voting about some stuff. Philippe, thank you for this. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And there's a lot of elections, so we'll probably talk again sometime before November.
Absolutely. Merci beaucoup, Jordan. Have a great day.
Philippe J. Fournier, you can find 338 Canada at 338canada.com. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can go to thebigstorypodcast.ca, where you'll find all of our episodes, including previous episodes on BC politics, if you are so inclined. You can always send us feedback by sending an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by picking up the phone and calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail. The Big Story is in all your favorite podcast players and your favorite smart speakers if you ask them to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.